Fox News host Tucker Carlson says it wasn't Russian collusion that swept Donald Trump into office. It was an angry electorate, tired of being ignored by the elites, a group whose power and wealth has grown beyond imagination, even as the rest of the country has withered. In his new book, Ship of Fools, Carlson offers a blistering critique of these new overlords. Our leaders are fools, Carlson concludes, unaware that they're captains of a sinking ship. In the signature and witty style that viewers of Tucker Carlson Tonight have come to enjoy, his book answers the all-important question: how do we put the country back on course?
Well, the book is called Ship of Fools, How a Selfish Ruling Class is Bringing America to the Brink of Revolution. Tucker Carlson joins us now. Tucker, it's good to see you. Welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Pat.
Hey, this whole thing, let me ask you about this so-called middle class. Who are they and what's happening to them, the white middle class? Where's it going?
Well, the middle class is the backbone of the country. A vibrant middle class is essential for a democracy, and they're dying. So for my lifetime, yours, our grandparents, for over 100 years, the middle class has been the majority in this country. It's defined what the country is. And in 2015, for the first time, that group became a minority, less than 50% of the country. This was a huge shift in our economy and in our social fabric, and it was almost unnoted by media organizations, including, I'm ashamed to say, by me. I wasn't even aware that it happened until I started writing this book. And yet, it really tells you everything you need to know about why the president got elected. If you're running a country as affluent and successful and large as this one, your main concern is making certain that people who make $80,000 a year have some security and some promise that their children will do better and some stake in the American economy. You don't want a country comprised only of the very rich and of the wholly dependent at the bottom. You know, welfare recipients and private equity moguls. That's a very unstable model. That's the Latin American model. That's what happened in Venezuela, where all of a sudden a small group of people controlled everything, and the population revolted with this radical left-wing populism of Hugo Chavez and now of Nicolas Maduro, and they wrecked the country. And so I guess I could bottom line it in one sentence by saying, whenever you have a big populist movement like the Trump movement, that's a sign that the people in charge have failed. They've made grave mistakes, and they need to fix those mistakes right away, or it will get worse.
Who are these elites that are captains of the Ship of Fools? Who are they? Are they only on the coasts of East Coast, West Coast? Is that where they are? Not across
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Primarily in places I have lived, and I just want to be clear that I'm not writing this book as a representative of coal miners in West Virginia. I'm not from West Virginia. I'm from La Jolla, California, and Georgetown. So I have a perspective, I think, that's pretty informed on the question of this group because I've lived among them all my life. And I'm not speaking simply of our political elites, but also of our economic and cultural elites, the people who make our foreign policy, the enormous nonprofit sector here in Washington of policy people who figure out how, you know, what country we ought to invade next, et cetera. And so I'm speaking of the people who make the lion's share of the decisions in this country, the 5% of the population that makes 90% of the significant decisions. And by the way, every country has a ruling class. People are hierarchical. The Old Testament is the story of, ruling classes and the decisions they made. There's nothing wrong with it.
What
I'm arguing against.
Have they got to be the rulers? I mean, did they just take power? I mean, is it given to them? Is it because of how much money they've got, or they went to Yale or Georgetown or whatever?
Well, sure. I mean, I would say that the SAT, strictly speaking, the SAT standardized testing is responsible for the society we now have. We decided 50 years ago, 60 years ago, to sort people by intelligence. That's what the SAT is, in effect, an IQ test, and shunt them into a small number of elite colleges, and from there into a small number of elite professions. And they moved to a small number of elite neighborhoods, married each other, and repeated the process with their own children, et cetera. So you basically have a very insular group running the country, very, very insular, and they, live in 20 zip codes, and they disproportionately control the lives of everybody else. I'm not even mad about that. I just think that if you're going to have a group like that, they better have deep empathy for the population of the country. They better really care about the country, and they better slow down and make sure they're making wise decisions. And when they mess up, as we all do, they need to take responsibility for their bad decisions and learn something from them. Exactly what you would ask of your own children, and they haven't.
A hypocrisy factor you pointed out in your book that's very well taken about where they send their children to school. You want to talk about, the public schools are pretty bad in most areas, but these elites don't send their kids where. Where did Obama send his children?
Well, to Sidwell Friends, which is a putatively Quaker school here in Washington, where the children of countless U.S. senators and ambassadors and titans of industry all send their children. And look, I send my children to public school. I raised them in the District of Columbia. We have terrible public schools. I'm not attacking anyone for that. I'm merely saying that if you're in charge of our political system and our economy and you have outsized power in our society, you ought to make sure that people who aren't as fortunate as you have access to decent schools for their kids. And they're not. They've given up on the public schools. And instead, they have decided that the future is in importing new people from other countries into our country. Okay, but what about the people who already live here? What about them? And of course, nobody cares in Washington. That's the point. Nobody cares about the middle of the country.
They condemned. It was amazing how the Democrats refused to allow the school children in Washington, D.C. to have school choice. They insisted they stay in that public school. They were all failing. I used to live in Washington for a time.
Exactly.
But
of course, because it doesn't affect them. It doesn't affect them at all. I mean, their children are going to be absolutely fine, and they're going to get into Princeton, and they're going to get jobs at McKinsey, and they're going to be, repeating the lives of their parents. So we have, all of a sudden, I grew up in a pretty middle-class country where even rich people sort of mingled with everybody else and went on vacation by car and stayed in motels and, got lunch at McDonald's. We don't live in that country anymore. The rich live a very separate existence from everyone else. And that makes it very hard for them to empathize with the population and to make decisions that benefit the population. This happened in Rome. This is a very familiar script that we're seeing play out.
Maxine Waters is sort of the poster child of the left. She has been acerbic against Trump. She tells people to assault Republicans and so forth. How much does her house cost? You have that in your book?
Maxine Waters, who represents or did represent, South Central Los Angeles, where the riots took place in 1992, an impoverished area. In that city, lives in one of the richest neighborhoods in the city, a neighborhood that the left would describe as non-diverse or segregated, overwhelmingly white, and she lives in a $4 million house. Now, look, I don't know how someone who's spent her entire life in so-called public service in Congress could afford a $4 million house. I asked the question and was dismissed as a bigot for doing it, but I think it's a fair question. But I also think it tells you a lot. The people who are telling you that you're a bigot because you're against diversity, whatever that is, are living in the least diverse neighborhoods in our country.
You've got a section here about a guy that I've never even heard of who apparently got the Pulitzer Prize, and he couldn't hold a job down in several news organizations, and suddenly he's lionized by this great writer. Talk about him, will you?
Well, I think you may be talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is one of the most popular writers on the left. And, I don't know him. I have no personal animus against him, but I decided to read because he is the recipient of so many awards from, our establishment. He must be a brilliant writer. So I actually read his major book, and I found it deranged, not only badly written and poorly argued and badly reasoned, but also a screed against another ethnic group. And so I grew up in a country where you were not allowed to attack people on the basis of their race or other immutable characteristics. That was called racism. Now, Ta-Nehisi Coates, in the name of fighting racism, is committing it pretty openly, not pretty openly, entirely, transparently, writing a whole book about how people are evil because of their skin color. And I'm thinking, is this allowed now? Are we for this? I'm not for that, actually. I don't think you should judge people by their race. I think it's immoral. But it's commonplace on the left now.
You also pointed out that we worked so hard to get integration in our schools.
Yes.
It was a big deal. You had to bring little black children into the white schools and so forth. But now, there's a movement apparently to have all black sections of universities and so forth. You've got an interesting talk about that.
Well, it's that almost like that scene in Animal Farm where the pigs repaint the slogans on the barn and make them the mirror image of what they once were. You're absolutely right. 50 years ago, the crowning achievement of American liberalism was ending school segregation. Brown versus Board in '54 took 15 years really to put it into effect. But liberals, when I was a kid, would always say, we desegregated the schools. And I never liked liberals, but I agreed with them. Good for you. We shouldn't have segregated schools. What is that? Now, liberals are leading the effort to resegregate schools. Harvard University last year had an African-American, a black graduation ceremony. And I'm thinking, well, why is that different from Greenville, Mississippi, 1955? It's not, of course, except now that liberals are pushing it. It's almost bewildering. It makes your head spin.
Last question. You think it's going to be a revolution, that there's such hatred and division being created by this elite class, that there might be a revolution of some kind?
Well, I hope no more than we've already had. I mean, the election of President Trump was a form of revolution. I mean, Republican voters voted for someone the Republican Party despised and that terrified the Democratic Party. And so that was a kind of political revolution. I think in general, revolutions, our American Revolution being the great exception, make things worse, that they're dangerous. You don't know where they're going to wind up. And so I hope not. What I pray for is stability and calm and continuity, what we've had for a couple hundred years. And I think the only way we get back to that is if the people in charge start paying attention to the people whose lives they affect.
All right, one last question. One of the very attractive news people in our department said Tucker used to wear the cutest little bow ties, and he's not wearing them anymore. I think I've got to get her an answer. What happened to your bow ties, Tucker?
It's very hard to walk through Penn Station in New York wearing a bow tie without being challenged to a fight. And I realized in the end, it's not worth it. It's too provocative.
Well, I'll give her that answer. Thank you, sir. The book is called Ship of Fools. It's an amazing story, and some of the stuff in here will shock you and what they're doing, but it's a bestseller, and you can find it wherever books are sold. Tucker, thanks for being with us. God bless you.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right.
I appreciate it.